I think using Shia as an adjective in those negative instances from a linguistic perspective has added to the normalization of Shia being identified as something negative, evil, again, in mainstream media, similar to when we look at how the term Iran is used as an adverb with another adjective and then a noun. So again, from Iranian-backed militias, Iranian-funded, Iranian-controlled. And I think so first of all, maybe just to reiterate again from what we mentioned about the proxy narrative, I think also control plays a major role here if we look through a colonial framework, because obviously it is very difficult for many to imagine that Shia in Lebanon, Iraq, or elsewhere have ties to Shia in Iran. Mm-hmm. And it is, I think it goes back just very much to the colonial control of then trying to portray Shia as proxies because they wouldn't necessarily be responsible for their own actions or think, but are rather just executing what someone told them to do. And I think it has a very violently dehumanizing component to it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. We're accustomed to Iran being depicted in a negative light in U.S. media and popular culture. But what about media in the Middle East? It turns out the region is drowning in anti-Iran propaganda, emanating from Western, Gulf, and oligarch-funded outlets that seek to turn the populations in the region against Iran and thus weaken the so-called resistance axis. In Lebanon, this plays out in a sectarian narrative that portrays Hezbollah as an Iranian proxy and depicts Shias as agents of an Iranian occupation of the country. This pattern has also been replicated in neighboring countries in an attempt to turn people against the regional forces that challenge U.S. imperialism. To understand this phenomenon, I'm joined by Denijal Jegic, professor of communication at Lebanese American University and author of a forthcoming research paper titled An Iranian Occupation of Lebanon, the Imperialist Media Discourse on Western Asia. But before we jump into it, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can help it grow by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news or by donating below on YouTube. Denijal, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
So I'm really excited to talk to you about this piece that you wrote, which hasn't been published yet, but will. So I got a sneak peek. And I think this is a really important topic because I think a lot of times we always talk about the way that the foreign country or the countries that are America's adversaries are depicted to Americans. We don't end up thinking that much about the way that those adversaries are actually also demonized in the regions that they actually exist in. And in the case of Iran, you know, in your piece, you make a really good point. You write that the idea of an alleged Iranian occupation of Lebanon appears to subsume biases, stereotypes, and conspiracy theories about Iran and Hezbollah, as well as Shiite Muslims in general. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on this particular conspiracy theory about this Iranian occupation of Lebanon that we're constantly hearing in Lebanese media, directly trying to target the population here.
Yeah, so this narrative about an alleged Iranian occupation of Lebanon, and sometimes also referred to as Iranian influence, Iranian presence, and there are different terms are being used both by media within Lebanon, international media, Western media, has become quite a part, as I would argue, part of the mainstream discourse by now, particularly in the current situation in Lebanon, where there is an ongoing economic crisis. There are numerous political problems obviously going on, and related also to further developments in the region. This has sort of incited even more this anti-Iranian sentiment, which is very closely related to anti-Shia sectarianism, both in political communication and in the media discourse. And oftentimes it's just a replication or even a recycling, as I would call it, of Orientalist archives. So we have on the one hand Western media that reproduces, and it has been reproducing for decades, the same content on Lebanon and Iran. And particularly if we look in the last couple of years, certain events in Lebanon that have been deemed as newsworthy in Western media, such as the beginning of the protests in 2019, the outbreak of COVID, the tragic port explosion in 2020, were just some of the events where major international, in particular US and European media, has framed their reporting on these events somehow within a context of Iran. So that includes identifying Iran, trying to somehow construct a connection to Iran or Iran's allies in Lebanon. So Iran has been quite central in the media reporting on Lebanon for a while, but oftentimes we see the same stories or the same structures being reproduced through different stories. And at the same time, of course, this has also appeared in Lebanese media. Obviously, if we look at the political economy, Lebanon is a rather small country that has a broad or has a very rich media spectrum. There's a lot of TV channels, news stations with different affiliations, with different funding related to several political parties, as well as foreign actors that are involved, and some of whom have a very open anti-Iranian stance. So at the same time, we can see and hear people talking about an Iranian occupation. We can read in some parts of Beirut the words Iran out, as if Iran were actually having a military occupation of Lebanon. And this has reached to an extent where there are certain entertainers that would tweet and ask for the so-called Iranian occupation to be lifted. So what is part of a very Orientalist narrative has really to some extent emerged or has penetrated the mainstream discourse. And this has to do with a lot of reasons that we can maybe discuss in detail, but obviously one of them is an over-exaggeration of any presence of Iran in Lebanon and the stereotypes and the reproduction of those stereotypes that are very Orientalist and oftentimes based on those civilizational binaries where Iran is identified as some source of evil and as the evil and backward sort of opposite to the enlightened and progressive West. And then, of course, sorry.
No, please continue. I'm nodding along in agreement.
Yeah, I was going to add, and of course, in the context of Lebanon, where we also have a very clear NGOization of the so-called civil society, there's obviously a lot of foreign money involved, and there is obviously a network of several NGOs, organizations, native informants, who might, to some extent, more or less openly peddle also those Western narratives that are oftentimes Orientalist and might be in line with Western ideas. So it is very common to read in Western and by now also in local media expressions such as Iranian influence, Iranian role, Iranian presence, and then of course the idea of Iranian-backed or Iranian-affiliated actors that, again, I think we could actually quote a very concrete example that was in one of the major French language newspapers of Lebanon in this week, where there was an article published that sort of tried to frame the Iranian assistance to Syria and to Syrian victims affected by this tragic earthquake that has killed so many people and devastated parts of Syria and Turkey, where we can see, the title being Iran seeks to build influence on the ruins of Syria. So even here, where the actual situation was Iran providing humanitarian aid to Syria, there is a narrative about Iran taking advantage of this tragic situation, this tragic disaster in Syria, and seeks to build its own influence. So again, we can see that there is Iran being somehow shown as inherently evil, dangerous, sneaky, destructive. It has some other goals that it's not openly showing. And then this article in particular is interesting because it actually quotes an Israeli as a source without identifying them as Israeli, as an expert. Oftentimes, obviously, if we look at the way that these articles are structured, there's some sort of expert involved who might be from a U.S. institute.
I'm just highlighting what you're talking about. The Israeli you're talking about is Elizabeth Zirkov. She might also be American, but she is in fact Israeli, and she actually served in the Israeli army and participated in the 2006 Israeli war on Lebanon that left many civilians, hundreds and hundreds of civilians killed, and destroyed civilian infrastructure intentionally. And she's also kind of made herself she's this anti-Iran analyst, really, who blames Syria and Iran for everything bad in the region. And she claims that Iran, that playing a role related to the earthquake represents a way for Iran here to gain legitimacy among Syrians and Iraqis. So Iranian aid is like nefarious and actually malicious as far as this Israeli is concerned. And then I just want to point out that it also, this is so funny. By the way, for those who are listening and cannot see, this article that Daniel's talking about appears in L'Orient today. I'm sorry if I'm butchering the name of that. I don't pronounce French words correctly. It's a Lebanese outlet that is, I believe, French-based. You told me who owns it. You mentioned who owns it.
I cannot recall right now, but there is a French language version of it, and I think this is an English translation of the original.
Yeah. So it's funny because it goes on to say Saudi news outlet Elif quoted a source from the Israeli military on February 10 who claimed to have information revealing Iran's intention to use the natural disaster as a chance to send arms to its affiliated militias in the country. So this is like some Israeli rumor that was pushed by some Saudi outlet that now is being quoted in a Lebanese outlet that's also quoted in Israeli on top of this. So it's like you can see the sourcing that goes into this anti-Iran sentiment that you're talking about. But sorry, I just wanted to point those things out, but please continue.
Exactly. I think it's an excellent example of so many things that are of structural nature and that are so problematic in Western media, which is, as you mentioned, so this is an analyst, an expert. So oftentimes these sources are highlighted as people who have particular knowledge, and their inherent bias is not necessarily, nor their affiliation is not necessarily identified in this article. And this is obviously also a way to perpetuate bias. And I think there was a paragraph also in this article I wanted to add that, as you mentioned, so there is a reference to a Saudi news outlet that quotes a source from the Israeli military, and then basically this source warned, if I remember correctly, was that Iran's presence would provoke Israeli forces to respond. So this is also a very clear normalization of Israeli violence, and implicitly also justifies future Israeli attacks because you're framed as some sort of response to whatever Iran does. So again, peddling this very colonial and very imperialist sort of perspective onto this that justifies and normalizes the existence of the Zionist entity and its military attacks on Syria, which have been ongoing for several years. So in the end, the piece is also centered somehow around Israeli comfort. Iran is demonized and also ridiculed because it is helping earthquake victims. So again, there is not particularly analysis, but rather an insistence that we can see again in so many, and this is just representative of a general phenomenon in mainstream media, that there's no particular substance or criticism against Iran, but rather, or not even a dialogue, but rather some sort of ridicule and incitement. And again, this article as well uses the terms Iranian-backed, and I think refers to Shia militiamen, so also highlighting this sectarian component. And again, there are many factors here that play a role beyond the bias, including political economy, agendas, and other ideological factors that might play a role.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And yeah, it also talks about Iraqi Shia militiamen, of course. So bringing it back to the issue of Lebanon, I think one of the ironies of the sort of Iranian occupation narrative, I mean, that you hear from certain segments of society here that are obviously just regurgitating what they're seeing in their respective in the media outlets that they're consuming. The irony is, of course, is that there is an occupation of Lebanese land still. And but can you remind our viewers about the details of that? Because as far as I understand, it's not Iran that's occupying Lebanese land. It's another country.
Yeah, depends on who you ask. Again, it is actually quite interesting how a lot of people will tell you Iran is occupying Lebanon, when in fact, Lebanon has been a victim of Zionist terrorism and Zionist colonialism for almost 8 decades. So there are, parts of Lebanon that are still under Israeli occupation. Beyond that, or maybe I could just very briefly provide a historical context for the viewers, which would be interesting to know in this case. So Lebanon has been a victim, as I said, of Israeli colonialism since 1948, when the Zionist entity proclaimed its state in occupied Palestine, where it has established an apartheid regime and continues to kill the indigenous population. Lebanon has been under has been a victim of Israeli attacks for several decades, but has been under Israeli occupation from 1982 until the year 2000. There have been several wars, including the 2006 war, a major military aggression of the Israeli regime against the Lebanese civilians and civilian infrastructure. And besides this, until today, there are numerous, on average, several daily violations of Lebanese airspace by Israeli military planes. And the Israeli regime continues to peddle a very genocidal rhetoric concerning Lebanon that includes openly genocidal intent and fantasy. So it is very clear how Lebanon continues to be threatened by the Zionist regime, which again puts us into the situation where you actually have an ongoing colonial intention towards Lebanon that is not coming from Iran, but from the Israeli, from the Zionist entity, while at the same time this discourse or the presence of an alleged Iranian occupation continues to increasingly take more attention in the mainstream media. But of course, beyond the Israeli occupation, there's obviously a very clear US influence in Lebanon, the presence of the United States in Lebanon. Obviously, also, if we think about the presence of the US in Western Asia, the sanctions against Syria have a major impact on Lebanon, on its situation, on its partial isolation in the region. And then on top of this, as I already mentioned previously, the presence of NGOs, the NGOization of Lebanon, and many NGOs that are backed and funded by German political parties, for example, by the European Union, by Western regimes that are themselves aligned with the Zionist entity and are allies of these policies. So this so-called soft power of Western regimes is not to be underestimated. And yet at the same time, you have Hezbollah, which is an indigenous liberation and resistance movement, and one, maybe the largest political party in terms of supporters in Lebanon, which is then being identified as a foreign power, foreign agent within this anti-Iranian narrative.
Yeah, that's all really important points with regard to this. I want to ask you though specifically, and I mean I know this because I covered the protest back in 2019, but you go back and you look at how Hezbollah basically was portrayed as this like proxy of Iran. So I guess let's start with this. How was the anti-Iran narrative that you're discussing used to frame and then even to manipulate the protests in Lebanon back in 2019 in both local and international media?
Yes, so in 2019, thousands of people went to the streets in Beirut and other parts of Lebanon to protest against the situation at that time, which was obviously an economic decline, political problems, and a lot of major problems that affected people and people's daily lives. And whereas different people went to the streets for different reasons with different motivations, and Lebanon is a very diverse country, the protests were very early on presented in major Western mainstream media as allegedly being anti-Iranian protests. So I remember at that time, the New York Times in particular and the Washington Post publishing in the first days and then later on several more articles in the first weeks of the protests, and basically claiming that the protesters, which were again not to be seen as a monolith because there were diverse crowds of people, but they were all identified as going to the streets to protest against an alleged Iranian influence, to be protesting against Iran, against Hezbollah. So again, a lot of those same Western frameworks and Orientalist tropes came up and were recycled and then used to represent or to report on these protests. So again, we've seen the same archives being, or the same structures being used for different and new narratives in mainstream media. And literally the same media that would call for sanctions, would justify sanctions, would then identify that Lebanese people are being, or would claim that Lebanese people are being subjugated by Iran and are fighting for their freedom. So again, those civilizational binaries of the West allegedly caring about the people and Iran being this very evil force, and what we could really refer to as a very sudden dramatic outburst of a concern by Western media allegedly about the Lebanese people. But so this anti-Iranian framework was adopted to really misrepresent many of these protests and to sell them to Western audiences as being in line with Western policies. And again, implicitly justifying potential regime change, US or other foreign intervention into Lebanon, again, with those key terms such as human rights, democracy, what else, freedom of speech, and all of those terms that come up time and time again when it comes to portraying on protests that take place in governments or places whose governments might, or parts of the governments might, not be aligned or openly opposed to US and Zionist strategies in the region.
Yeah, and I want to just add to that during this time, it was October 2019 that we had the protests in Lebanon. There was also protests that took place that same month in Iraq. And very quickly you saw the same sort of framework being imposed on the protests in Iraq, where it was like, oh, they want Iran out. These are actually anti-Iran protests. They're resistance protests. They want like America in and Iran out. Like it was the same exact thing that we saw take place. And it really is, I'm not denying that maybe there are some elements on the ground in these protests who might feel those ways. There certainly was in Lebanon, especially as the protests continued and the media coverage turned the resistance supporters off from even being a part of it at one point. But still, it's what you have is like the West imposing what it wants to on protests to sort of hijack them, to use them for, imperialist policies. But, in your paper, Daniel, you argue that since the Islamic Revolution, the West has engineered or manufactured consent, to use a Chomskyan term, and you talk about Chomsky in your piece, about Iran being this common enemy across the region and actually around the world, with the reason being, of course, to demonize Iranian support for resistance to imperialism. And you, paraphrasing others, you actually write that the designation of Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism by the US needs to be viewed within the context of Iran's role in the regional battle against imperialism, colonialism, and in particular Zionism, as well as Iran's own fight against terrorist groups such as ISIS. And I think that ISIS part is so crucial, because with the rise of ISIS, you saw a lot of media in the West try to make it seem as though the U.S. was at the front lines of the fight of ISIS, basically covering up for the fact that U.S. policy is actually what gave rise to ISIS, but also then demonizing any Iranian efforts to try to weaken ISIS or fight ISIS. And Iran played a frontline role in doing that. And in fact, the U.S. ended up murdering Qasem Soleimani, who was a very important figure in the region in the fight against ISIS. But all that said, I'm curious if you can explain how this framing of Iran as a common enemy has in fact been manufactured since 1979, and speak a bit about why.
Yes. So if we look at the current media representation and political discourse, as I mentioned, I refer to this as an archive, recycling of archives. And in the case of the representation of Iran and the discourse around and towards Iran, we can go back to the late 70s and identify how for the past more than 4 decades, Iran has represented a major threat to US designs in Western Asia, to US imperialism, and of course to the Zionist entities' colonialism. That means that Iran is an enemy to the West, not only globally, but also in particular in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, in other parts of the region, because Iran has supported indigenous liberation and resistance movements, including in Lebanon and in Palestine. And this is why it really represents in many ways a nightmare to the imperialist and colonialist perspectives onto this region. So Iran has been identified as a common enemy. Obviously, the events in the late 70s, and then also the Iranian Revolution, but then also the Israeli occupation of Lebanon in the early 80s, and the formation of the Lebanese resistance obviously played a major role in the formation of particular alliances in the region and in the outlook of the US and its allies and its proxies onto Lebanon, Palestine, and beyond. So if we look at today's representation, a lot of the things keep on coming up again and again, with Iran being identified. And if we go back to the George W. Bush administration, identified Iran as part of this axis of evil, was within the context of the so-called war on terror. Today, the discourse is about Iranian proxies, and anyone supporting Iran or getting support from Iran identified as being a proxy. So there is a demonization, identification of Iran as the source of evil, but also because Iran does represent a major threat, and Iran's allies, such as Hezbollah, represent the most imminent threat to the survival of the Zionist entity, and as such form, again, a major threat to the survival of apartheid, the continuation of ethnic cleansing in Palestine and beyond, and just ideologically a contestation of US exceptionalism and the continuous colonization in the region. So Iran's continued existence, and also Iran's strength after decades of sanctions and attempts to isolate it internationally, continues, I think, in many ways to expose the weaknesses of the West, of Western regimes in Western Asia, and their incapability to actually turn the situation to their favor.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is that it does? It's like, does this even actually work? I want to like zoom in a bit on the proxy narrative that you mentioned. You talk in your paper about about the way that this propaganda personifies a state like Iran, and communicates through these metaphors where Iran becomes this like horrible villain that's acting through its, in the case of Lebanon, it's Shia proxy. And I want to just show a few examples that you actually point out in your piece. Here's and the source of these examples will not come as a surprise to most people. Here is one. Hang on. This is in Al Arabiya, which is I don't know why it's not letting me accept. There we go. Which is a Saudi-funded outlet, which is like a Saudi state outlet, I believe. The title is "Hezbollah will not turn Lebanon into another Iran," and I like the exclamation point in the title, by the way. So it's not just Hezbollah will not turn Lebanon into another Iran. It's Hezbollah will not turn Lebanon into another Iran, right? And then we have this other piece. This is Asharq al-Awsat. It's called "Welcome to Iranian Lebanon." And this is just a couple of years ago. This is from March 2021, right? So these are pretty recent pieces. And this is not uncommon. These are just two examples among, many in like a sea of anti-Iran propaganda that equates Hezbollah with Iran because they're allies. So can you explain the media manipulation here, its history and demonizing states this way, and how we as media consumers can spot these tactics?
Yeah. I think these are two very good examples of so many articles that keep on reoccurring. And I think they have a lot of functions eventually, because they reproduce, of course, this Western narrative, but then turn it around by identifying Iran in particular as this imminent threat that is either. So again, we have on the one hand the idea that Lebanon is under Iranian occupation, but then other articles focus on the idea that Iran might invade and Lebanon is being turned into Iran. And even here, this idea of turning Lebanon into Iran goes again back to those very Orientalist civilizational binaries where, and if we think about Lebanon, where Lebanon is imagined as this, what during the colonial times emerged, the Paris of the Middle East or the Switzerland of the Middle East. And then Iran is represented as this Muslim sort of, again, in this very Islamophobic and Orientalist framework, as this Muslim danger that will take away the civilization that Lebanon has. And I think it goes back really to this dichotomy, to this binary in many of these articles, also because it's, I think, easy to comprehend for many audiences, easy to portray Iran as this evil force that will destroy Lebanon's identity. But there is much more to it, including oftentimes sectarian incitement. So the idea, again, is that any form of resistance against imperialism, capitalism, colonialism that is somehow anti-Western could be identified as Iranian, and then identifying a person, individual, group, organization as either being pro-Iranian, Iranian-backed, Iranian-affiliated, Iranian-funded, and all of these terms that we keep on reading, obviously is a way to delegitimize them, to make their presence or their voice being either less important, to silence them, or to just identify themselves as an external threat. And we've seen that in the sectarian, in those sectarian components of such articles that then identify the Shia population of Lebanon as something that is external, as people who are not from Lebanon, who are allegedly not Lebanese, who are not part of Lebanese culture, society, history, but who are sometimes presented as agents, as foreign agents working for Iran. So again, there are several racist implications here. But pretty much also a dehumanization of people in order to disregard actual concerns that a lot of people in Lebanon have when it comes to colonialism, when it comes to Western power, but also it also erases the very rich history in the region, the connections between Lebanon and its neighbors, including Iran, the social, economic, historical, religious ties that have existed for centuries and continue to exist. And these are being removed in this discourse, whereas the presence of the United States, France, or any other foreign Western power is then presented as actually being something that is natural. And in this context, then also the violence of the Israeli enemy is naturalized into something that is quote unquote normal. But then and then also, obviously, it's a very colonial framework as such, because it identifies indigenous people, in particular if we talk about Hezbollah, because that's oftentimes what these articles are framed around, which is, as I said, an indigenous resistance movement. It has been obviously identified, designated as a so-called terrorist organization by the United States, by its proxies and allies, and then some small European countries as well. It's always quite interesting when you have a Baltic country with 1 million inhabitants suddenly announcing that they announce that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. And it's also obviously, very obvious that many of these things are done to please the United States by its puppet regimes. But what I'm saying is that there's an overemphasis, even beyond this, on Hezbollah in particular, because Hezbollah is a very powerful political and military force in Lebanon and beyond. And then identifying it as a proxy takes away from its rich history, from its very strong ideology, to sort of disregard and to criminalize basically the indigenous people's survival, their existence, their socioeconomic structures and organizations. It is in many ways a very violent and colonial discourse that has produced this proxy narrative.
Right. And I want to just note that, back in, I think it was like 2007, it was Seymour Hersh who wrote this article. I think it was for the New Yorker. I think it was called like The Redirection. And the whole article is about how post 2006, right, after Hezbollah pushed Israel out of Lebanon again, they were celebrated across the region, across sects. I think there was even like a poll done in Egypt for who were like the three most popular figures, and Hassan Nasrallah was one of the top three, right? And Egypt was, of course, a very Sunni country. So, you couldn't really imagine that happening today when the region's become so much more sectarianized. But that was the case back in like 2007. And it really, really concerned the US establishment and, of course, the Israelis and the Saudis, by the way. And this is when the Dick Cheney, and at that time it was like Prince Bandar was the intelligence chief of Saudi Arabia. They came up with this plan to basically push anti-Shia sentiment across the region and to promote the idea of like Sunni identity. as an effort to weaken support for Iran and groups like Hezbollah. And ultimately, this helped lay the foundation for what would become support for ISIS and Al Qaeda groups across the region, particularly like when it came to the war in Syria, ultimately, even in Iraq. I even remember when there was like ISIS took over Mosul, there was all these articles about Sunni rebels taking over Mosul, getting rid of the bad Shias, And the reason I raise this is just to say, there is a huge amount of anti-Shia bigotry that this propaganda has contributed to, whether it's Gulf funded, whether it's US funded, whether it's European funded. So this is a really good example of this kind of anti-Shia bigotry we're talking about. This is, of course, in Western media, but I want you to look at this example and then multiply it by a lot more when you consider how bad it became in the Arabic media. But this is The Guardian back in 2016 or 2017. This is after the Syrian government had taken back Aleppo, and it had the help of its Iranian allies as well as its Iraqi allies, which the Western media always referred to as Shia militias, even though they weren't all Shia, the Hashd al-Shabi, the Popular Mobilization Forces. But the claim here is that from Tehran to Beirut, Shia militias aim to firm up Iran's arc of influence. And you always saw this idea of either an Iranian arc of influence, a Shia arc, a Shia crescent. Mm-hmm. Speaking of Shia crescent, here's another example. This is actually recent. I hadn't seen this in a while. I was just looking up Shia crescent, for example, because this became a very common term. Mm-hmm. The idea of a Shia crescent, meaning Shia resistance forces across from Iraq through Syria to Lebanon, as though this was like some evil thing, which identified Shias as being associated with something very negative. This is from 2023. This is an op-ed in Le Monde, which is a very well-known French newspaper, very mainstream. The Shiite crescent of Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq is at risk of crumbling. This is January 2023. I didn't know people used this language anymore. And it's really disgusting. I mean, replace, Shia with a different term. And Shias historically in the region have been oppressed, have been treated badly, have tended to be like the peasant class, and like they're the minority in many countries, not in Iraq or Iran, obviously, but like in Lebanon they have been. And the point is just to say, like, this is pure bigotry. You could imagine like the disgust we would hear if somebody tried to say the Jewish crescent. Absolutely. Or a Jewish arc of influence. That would be completely unacceptable, as it should be. Absolutely. This is completely unacceptable. But I raise this just to talk about, again, the anti-Shia sectarianism that these framings promote. How do these media and Western government framings to try to make Iran look evil through sect contribute to anti-Shia bigotry? And how does this reinforce the colonial narrative? And you can maybe give examples here of, in particular, how that rolls over into what we see here in Lebanon, or what we have seen in Lebanon over the years, and the way the Shia population has been depicted because of Hezbollah, because of negative framings of Iran.
Exactly. So it has, as you said, we could multiply this by so many times because it is very normalized. It has become normalized to use Shia as an adjective, and then add any sort of noun that has a negative connotation. So we think about, can remember Shia stronghold, Shia militia, Shia this and that. So it's always something related to war, confrontation from a negative context, with Shia being perpetrators. And I think using Shia as an adjective in those negative instances from a linguistic perspective has added to the normalization of Shia being identified as something negative, evil, again, in mainstream media, similar to when we look at how the term Iran is used as an adverb with another adjective and then a noun. So again, from Iranian-backed militias, Iranian-funded, Iranian-controlled. And I think it, so first of all, maybe just to reiterate again from what we mentioned about the proxy narrative, I think also control plays a major role here if we look through a colonial framework, because obviously it is very difficult for many to imagine that Shia in Lebanon, Iraq, or elsewhere have ties to Shia in Iran. Mm-hmm. And it is, I think it goes back just very much to the colonial control of than trying to portray Shia as proxies because they wouldn't necessarily be responsible for their own actions or think, but are rather just executing what someone told them to do. And I think it has a very violently dehumanizing component to it. And of course, the normalization of this narrative, of this language, adds to inequalities and histories of racism and persecution, which have existed in Lebanon and beyond. In particular, if we think about the south of Lebanon being under the Israeli occupation, and many people of different sects suffering, but obviously the south also does have a majority Shia population, and I think there is a lot, as I think you and I are both aware of, in daily discourse. You can hear things about Shia outside of the media that you might not hear about people of other who are identified as belonging to other sects. And even think about a context of Lebanon where there are so many religious groups. We don't necessarily not even hear them in such a context, but I cannot remember the last time I read something in the New York Times or Washington Post that would identify, that would even discuss the religious diversity of Lebanon or identify other demographic groups in such a context. And then, of course, this goes back then, becomes normalized. There's, of course, also a class component to it. I think class analysis is very important, socioeconomic differences. But then also, if you look at currently in Lebanese media, and then even more so, what has emerged more and more increasingly since the protests in 2019 are so-called independent and alternative media outlets, which are oftentimes Instagram pages that have funding, sometimes from the European Union, again, Western NGOs, and so on, and many of whom seem to be focusing on Shia, Lebanese Shia, and Iran, and seem in many ways to have similar interests in terms of what kind of topics they choose to talk about and what kind of perspectives they choose to adhere to. So often it's very similar, again, to Western mainstream media, coming from a perspective not necessarily of structural analysis, but very clearly identifying, focusing on Iran, focusing on Hezbollah, and again, oftentimes resorting to this fear-mongering about Hezbollah being responsible for anything that's going on in Lebanon. And again, because I think it is easy to sell to audiences narratives they already know, instead of actually analyzing.
So I have pulled up on the screen, you're talking about Instagram pages. This is one that's quite well known. It's called Megaphone. It bills itself as you can see, if you can see the bio, it's built as independent online media platform, but it's not independent. It's certainly an online media platform, but if you go to Megaphone's, you can go to Megaphone's website and see it for yourself. It lists who it's funded by, and it receives funding from the EU, the European Endowment for Democracy, which is the equivalent of the National Endowment for Democracy of the United States, which was founded by like the CIA, basically. It's a CIA cutout that funds civil society groups, media in global South countries in an effort to push a U.S. agenda. It's, across Latin America, across the Middle East. It's often been used to push coups and these kinds of things. And if you look at their page, I mean, a lot of their posts, like anti-Bashar, here's like 2 posts with Nasrallah's face on it, anti-Hezbollah. And also they have a lot of, when they're not talking about Lebanon and blaming a lot of what's going on in either Syria, here's another Syria one. There was even a post they got a lot of backlash for. Almost every single comment to the post was negative, because it was basically saying we should not get rid of sanctions. Here's one called In the Presence of the Butcher. That's about Bashar, as you can see, Bashar al-Assad. But yeah, they were saying, don't lift the sanctions. Bashar's trying to use us here. It was this one saying relief and aid to Syria after the earthquake, 5 lies. And it tries to say that anybody saying that sanctions are the problem is basically lying. But when it's not talking about Lebanon, oftentimes you'll see it doing anti-Iran posts. Here's about the Iranian regime, more about Iran. You just go down and there's just like a really disproportionate number of posts about Iran that you won't see about, for example, Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you can go, we've come to know this, like, it's very slick. If you can see on the screen, the thumbnails are really nice. The artwork's pretty decent. Here it goes on more about Assad. Man, they really hate Assad. But the point is that this is like slickly funded, and it's meant to target younger people who like Instagram and who get their news from Instagram. And so there are a lot of young Lebanese who maybe aren't sectarian, they're just like, they want a better government, a better country as they watch this collapse happen. And they're consuming this media that's telling them it's all Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran's fault. So anyways, I just wanted to show that as an example, but really this is not even as reprehensible. I forgot about this article I wanted to show from The Guardian. This is from 2017 as well. It's also by the same author as the last Guardian article I showed, which was this guy, Martin Shulov. And this was after Syria had retaken Aleppo. East Aleppo had been occupied by al-Qaeda-linked insurgents for years. They were celebrated as freedom fighters in the West. And after the area was taken back by the government, which many in Aleppo viewed as actually a liberation, not as a conquering, though it was described that way in a lot of Western media. This article is titled "Iran Repopulates Syria with Shia Muslims to Help Tighten Regime's Control." Okay, so this comes, if you read the article, I'm not going to go through it too much, but you can go find it if you'd like. The source of this claim is a person from a group called Ahrar al-Sham, which was an extremist Sunni supremacist jihadist group that had played a role in occupying East Aleppo. There's no other proof other than the one guy saying this, and an entire Guardian article was written about this. And I mean, this is just pure bigotry, and it's a lie that Iran is repopulating Syria with Shia Muslims. It's an absolute lie. There is no proof this ever happened. Syria doesn't even have, it has a tiny, tiny, tiny minority Shia population that was actually besieged throughout the war by extremist groups. So anyways, I just wanted to, this is like one of the most extreme examples I've seen in US media because it's just so disgusting. And also, again, untrue. Anyways, Daniel, now that we have that out of the way, I wanted to ask, how is all of this used to justify sanctions on any movement or country associated with Iran? We know that in the year 2023, sanctions are the US's primary method of warfare.
Also, just wanted to add maybe one more comment on the last headline that you showed, because I think what's also this is representative of is, again, this idea of the Shia population being a demographic threat. So again, this dehumanization, but the idea that Shia are spreading somehow and that they are a threat to civilization as we know it. And it's just reminded me of the when COVID first emerged at the beginning of 2020. And there were some people in Lebanon identifying it, again, in relation to Hezbollah and Iran. And I remember this one particular article where was an opinion piece where the writer argued that the Shia population will be, in particular, exposed to COVID because of Shia fighters in Syria and because Iran is aligned with China. So people really go to great lengths and come up with all sorts of justifications for these tropes. But yeah, and this also, again, actually relates to sanctions, because much of the proxy narrative and the idea of Shia or Iranian, which are also sometimes just, I think, used as synonyms at times, is used to justify sanctions, because obviously sanctions being a form of economic warfare and having the goal of regime change, to altering power relations and to change economic situations to the benefit of those who are imposing sanctions, which are mostly the United States and their proxies, such as the European Union, through oftentimes, again, this discourse of democracy, human rights, or helping the people against the regime. I think regime is one of also those terms are used when it comes to Iran and Syria, but not used when talking about allies or proxies of the West. And in this case, I think in many ways, sanctions are trying to enforce Orientalist fantasies. So put in place actual geopolitical situations that do not exist yet, such as what the United States has been wanting for decades, an Iranian defeat, an Iranian capitulation, right? So sanctions as a way to achieve the Western dream of more imperialism, more colonialism. But then also in this case, we've seen that with many individuals and groups being sanctioned due to their alleged or actual ties to Iran, the proxy narrative being used. And this has cut off for many people access to resources, to medicine. It has affected people's daily lives because sanctions do affect the population. The idea is that regimes should change or be overthrown, or to coerce people into trying to remove their own government. And I think we can also think about sanctions as obviously an economic extension of traditional warfare. And then again, when it comes to US-Israeli visions of Western Asia, they cannot be implemented without violence. If we think about, I mean, if there was no violence, the Zionist entity could not exist. Apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide, all of these policies can only exist through continuous violence. And sanctions, being an economic warfare, are in fact an extension of this. But interestingly, from a media perspective, from a media discourse, you will find people in countries that are subjected to sanctions who would support those sanctions, because the discourse is that the US or the EU or whoever is trying to help the local population by holding their leaders accountable. And also completely obscures the power relations. Who is the United States to have the right to decide about who has access to what? I mean, the entire structure, again, is a very violent one. And I think sanctions have obviously been successful to an extent to which they have cut off people from access to means that they need for their livelihoods, but they have not been able to achieve what the United States and a Zionist entity have been trying to.
Right, exactly. And I guess it goes without saying, obviously, like, who benefits from all this is all the people you just mentioned. But I'm just wondering if you could place it in the broader context of capitalism and imperialism, all of these depictions.
Thinking about the relation between colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism is very important, in particular in Western Asia, because we cannot divide those individual issues. Capitalism in many ways enforces colonialism. And I think we can maybe just look at the Zionist entity as an example, where there is a colony that has developed all sorts of different weapons industries and technologies that it keeps building and expanding, surveillance technology, and so on. And in many ways, it was capitalism, one of the many reasons, expansion of markets, why the Zionist entity was able to normalize its ties with other regimes in the region that are aligned also with the United States and their Western allies. So I think it does play a major role, but it's oftentimes left out in analysis. And we do need more structural analysis to these issues to actually identify who is benefiting at the end of the day of all of these sanctions and other violent policies that affect millions of people on a daily basis.
Yeah, I wanted to also, show this article. By the way, this is God, The Guardian. I'm really just like picking on The Guardian today, but the title, for those who are listening and cannot see it, is "Iran is becoming global drone producer on back of Ukraine war," says U.S. I like how what the U.S. says as a headline. And of course, we saw for weeks and weeks and weeks the U.S. was losing its mind over Iran possibly giving drones to Russia. I mean, it was really, Iran is always made into a villain, but it was made into a villain specifically in the war in Ukraine for selling these drones to Russia. Your paper focused mostly on Lebanon and the region to some degree, but how do you see this anti-Iran narrative playing out on the global stage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the current situation in Ukraine is another example of how easy it has become, not only to accuse Iran of anything, but to write anything about Iran and get away with it. And I think if we look at the situation in Ukraine, obviously the Zelensky regime is aligned with the West. Zelensky is a great supporter of the Zionist entity and has at least one occasion said that he would love to turn Ukraine into a greater so-called Israel. So I think here it was from the beginning quite clear where he stands, where this regime stands ideologically, obviously being backed by the European Union. Obviously, Ukraine has become a central component of the EU political communication in its all of these senseless words such as values and shared values and democracy and defending Western rights and so on. And I think it's very easy, again, for Western political discourse and media to place Iran at the other end, especially because Iran is aligned, is an ally of Russia and of China, major powers that are actually resisting or opposed to NATO expansion and US imperialism. But I think after having seen how Iranian humanitarian aid can be demonized into something very inherently evil, it is not surprising that we see all sorts of identifications of Iran as a source of evil. I think it's ridiculous in many ways. Many of these headlines really appear ridiculous. You might sometimes wonder whether this is satire or not. But then again, thinking about how dangerous it is, because it reaches millions of people around the world on a daily basis, and just eventually leads to manufacturing consent for violence that will affect regular people.
Yeah, I also think it speaks to, we talk about the framework of Iran, and you think about the war on terror, right? When George Bush came up with the axis of evil. And you see how that framework has been like blown up, right? To apply it now as this, like, now we see as we enter this multipolar era where the US has really big anxieties about the rise of China and Russia, where we now have Iran being framed as a leader alongside China and Russia in this quote unquote axis of authoritarianism, in an effort to justify demonizing entire groups of countries now. So it's not just like Venezuela in Latin America and Iran in the Middle East and then China and Asia. It's like all of these countries together are an evil group of countries. So I think it's really interesting to see how that propaganda can be repurposed as the main like war shifts from one of like just targeting the Middle East or just targeting Latin America to this like new Cold War era that we're in. But I think a good place to end on would be that, given everything we've talked about, it's important that we understand, as you've reiterated, who the real aggressors are in all of this, right? It reminds me of like, what is it? Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign minister, essentially talked about the jungle and the garden, right? And it's actually the garden that is the violent one. As you mentioned, you talk about Israel and imposing apartheid. You talk about the US and Europe imposing imperialism requires so much violence. Mm-hmm. While Iran is actually the one that's subjected to all of this violence. And the reason for that isn't because of Iran's form of government. It's not because Iran isn't the kind of democracy America wants to see. Not that America's even a democracy. Iran is subjected to all of this for daring to resist its own subjugation and for helping others resist their own subjugation. And here I'm talking about Palestinian groups, Lebanese groups, being partnered with Syria, being partnered with groups in Iraq. And I think that's really, really important to emphasize. I'm not sure if you want to add anything to that.
Absolutely. No, actually, yeah, I completely agree. And I think this garden and jungle metaphor was quite representative of those anxieties that the West is going through. And as you mentioned before, the United States is placing certain groups of countries into categories. If we again think about capitalism being one of the factors here, about the global distribution of power. So Europe and the United States together are a minority in this world when it comes to their size of their population, and still have this very strong power all over the world, obviously, of course, because of colonialism. European culture, European wealth today is based on the bloods of millions of indigenous people all around the world who were victims of this colonization. But I think in a more multipolar tendency that we are maybe seeing today, the West becomes increasingly anxious about the white supremacy, which has been a global power structure. And I think this metaphor that Borrell proclaimed was an expression of this anxiety, because you cannot keep global apartheid alive where a small minority of privileged Westerners gets to decide who they want to sanction, who they want to kill, when the vast majority of the world's population is on the receiving end of those sanctions and evil policies. So I think that's very important to remember, and that change definitely is something that is in progress. And I think, again, going back to Iran, as you said, it has been resisting for decades and very successfully so. And I think it's just the entire discourse in the West on Iran is a result of the Western capability to actually destroy Iran, because it shows to the West its weaknesses.
Daniel, I want to thank you for joining me once again for the hour. This is such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see more progressive anti-imperialist content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest breakthrough news content. And if you want to support our work and get access to exclusive content, head over to patreon.com/breakthroughnews.